our next Leading Thinking webinar. My name is Roger Hitchcock. Great to see some familiar names online. We're just waiting for everybody to join and to enter the room. While we're doing that, please let us know where you are logging on from. It would be great if we could have an idea of where you are sitting at the moment. I'm currently based in Pretoria, where we're having a boiling hot summer's day. So it'd be great if you could just in the chat box, warm up your fingers by letting us know where you're logging on from. Say hi to everybody, and then we'll take it away in a couple of minutes' time. We are talking today, obviously, about ISO 37000. This thing called ISO 37000. It is, as you can see, the first international standard on good organizational governance. Now, what that doesn't mean, obviously, is that there hasn't been significant thinking about organizational governance beforehand at the highest level. But what it does do in a sense, and as we go through the next 45 minutes out together, we'll pick up on some of the key implications of it being a very broad, very well bought into, in a sense, standard. We're also going to look quite strongly at what actually do we do about it? Because the challenge often with governance standards is that we see them, we read them, but actually we need to ask the question, not what are they, but what do they do for us? What do we need to do in response to them? And so that's certainly going to be the approach that we take in the next in our next few minutes together. Please, as we go, if you have any questions, we'll stop and I'll pause and ask if there are any questions. Please put them onto the chat box. And yeah, great to see Jordan, Stanley, great to see you. Nairobi, Joburg. If the rest of you can let us know where you're logging on from, it'll be good to just have an idea of where everybody is sitting. Please also, if you have Q's and A's, please put your questions on the Q&A box and we'll pick them up either during the process of the webinar or towards the end of the webinar where there's an opportunity to ask any questions. So ISO 37000. A significant document because, number one, it's linked to a significant organization. ISO, International Standards Organization, creates and manages and works with a number of different standards which we apply and can use in and across our businesses. However, ISO 37000 is in some ways quite different, and those are some of the things we want to pick up on. For those of you, who aren't aware of SODAR, we provide an integrated boardroom solution. So where are we coming from and why do I want to be as practical as possible in this session? Is because we find that we get lots of questions, both in the boardroom, both from aspiring directors, as well as when we run training programs, what do we need to know so that we can equip ourselves as well? So guide, appoint, educate. Essentially, we partner with boards to help them navigate their unique journey. And you see why that's important, because while ISO 37000 is a standard, it's an interesting type of standard, and it's been presented by the ISO organization as almost something that doesn't really fit the box. And in a sense, that's what governance is in another way. And we'll pick up on that as well, because each one of us have a unique journey. And so we need to look at this thing, the standard, and say, how do we use it to improve our boardroom performance through practical advisory and governance services? And so, as I said, what I'm going to aim to do is try to answer the question, what do we do about it? There are 5 key things I'm going to pick up on and look at what do we need to stop about? What do we need to stop and think about? And then how do we move forward from that point on? As we start there, let's unpack a little bit about what are the ISO 37000 standards. It's called the Guidance on Good Organizational Governance. They're a recognized set of guidelines and guidance on best practice. So best practice is obviously something we all look for from whatever perspective we're in, whenever there's a topic or a theme we have to address. It's very common to look and say, what's best practice in this area? And in a sense, that's what the ISO organization has done in governance, is gather together a whole lot of different guidance documents, guidance recommendations. And that's where it's quite different from other guidance, from other ISO standards, is it is definitively a set of guidance recommendations as opposed to a set of things that we have to tick boxes against. And that's quite important. That makes it not certifiable. In other words, this is a standard that is not prescriptive. It's a descriptive standard. It describes what good governance looks like, in a sense, looking from the outside in, and I'll show you that in a slide or two. It's not about prescribing exactly what governance looks like in your organization, but it's describing the outcome which you need to then work out how to get to. It's a framework to align. So if you are looking comparatively, you can say, well, are we taking everything into account? Are we thinking through everything we need to think through? And it's designed to be enabling and complementary to legislation and regulations, as well as the other ISO standards. Many of us have looked at things like ISO 31000, which is the risk standard, ISO 9000, which is the quality assurance standard. So there's a lot of other ISO standards that fill the gaps and tell us how to do some of the other things in the area. And so, in summary, it's a standard that is enabling. It's a guidance for application that creates some unique challenges. It's comparative, so it does provide this consensus benchmark. What that means is if you as a company want to make a statement, or your business wants to make a statement on the fact that it is well governed, it would be good to look and say, against what? And so this does provide some benchmarks against which to say we adhere to, we comply to, we provide, or we take guidance from the likes of ISO 37000. It's complementary, as mentioned, with the other ISO standards. And so it doesn't answer all the questions across every aspect of your business. It does take quite a macro view, quite a strategic, a governance view of the business, as opposed to an operational detail view of the business. And it's inclusive. There were over 70 countries and organizations involved in the compilation, the editing. It took 3 or 4 or 5 years to put together. So it's a significant document. And in a sense, what it does provide us is almost like a ratchet point where we can't go back from ISO 37000. It is something that is across, it's very broad, and it covers, and it brings the governance conversation very much into every single boardroom around the world. What does it look like? And what are some of the key elements? And this webinar is going to look at some of these elements. But as we go forward, and what we're doing at Sadara is really looking and seeing how we are aligned, and I'll show you some thoughts in terms of that. In one sense, there's very little that is brand new in ISO 37000. It's not a new set of thinking about governance. It's a consolidation of a lot of the thinking that has been working and in a sense permeating and being nurtured over the last few years. It follows from some significant statements like in 2019, where the Business Roundtable in the States said the purpose of a business is not purely about profits for shareholders, but the purpose of a business is about the community that we serve, our stakeholders, the stakeholder inclusivity, the stewardship models of governance. What it looks like is a set of concentric circles, and there are 2 elements that I want to highlight, and I'll pick up on as we go through our time together. It's actually based on what is called a philosophy of outcomes-based governance, and where that comes from is in the early days of thinking about corporate governance, thinking about governance of organizations. A lot of the emphasis was on the internal structures and systems that provide good governance to companies. In other words, policies, procedures, processes, structures, form. Over the last 5 or 10 years, the shift has gone from internal to external. It started with a stakeholder perspective, stakeholder inclusivity, started with shifting to the best interests of the company and not just shareholders. It started to shift as well to saying governance is about the impact on others, which means the perspective on governance that is most accurate is that from the outside in, as opposed to from the inside out. Many companies put out wonderful statements of their governance structures, and yet were found wanting. Biggest example of that is the likes of Enron from the early 2000s. And in the last 20 years, many companies have also fallen into that same trap. And so outside in is what is critical from a governance point of view. And there are 3 key symptoms or manifestations, or in a sense, fruit of good governance. And those are, if we look at the bottom there, ethical governance. So the outside circle are the governance outcomes. An ethical company is deemed to be well governed, because we've had conversations, we've thought about how the behavior is linked to the beliefs and the purpose, and you'll see why that is important. Obviously, if we go around, to effective performance, a company that doesn't perform and is not well controlled in order to facilitate performance isn't a well-governed company either. So it's not just about ethics and values, it's also about actually achieving your purpose and delivering on deliverables, all of those kind of things. And that's where performance is important. But also, our companies don't exist in a vacuum. They are impacted by and impact on a range of other entities and parties. And so this concept of responsible stewardship, interesting phrase, because often that is used, the other phrase used is responsible citizenship, but responsible stewardship. In other words, when you're looked at from the outside looking in, are you seen as a responsible steward of what you have available to you? And so that's the perspective that I think is really important. Now, how do we get there? And this is probably one of the most significant shifts in thinking. And as I said, it isn't new. It's a consolidation or a solidification of thinking that has been around for a while, that at its core, every single company has a purpose. Now, that's always been the case, but putting purpose at the center, as ISO 37000 does as well, also expands it and says it's not just about a singular purpose. It's about an expression of what you truly believe, to what you value and what you truly believe to be valuable. And I'll raise that as one of the key points in what to do about this, is we need deeper conversations around what we truly believe to be valuable. And so purpose and values are at the core, and that purpose has to be broader than just financial, because companies are more than just financial entities. What it looks like then, in brief, is that ultimately, if we start with purpose and values, we've got to then ask the question, how do we generate value? Not just financial value, but if we define value and purpose broader than just finance, what does that look like? What is our business model, or not even our business model, our value generation model? What do we need to achieve to get there? So what is our strategy? And this is really what the role of governors is to do, is to convert purpose to a functioning model of generation, creation, delivery, protection of value. We do that by what we pursue into the future, but in the present, that's where we get the word direction from, or director from, because directors are the ones pointing in a direction. We obviously work together as a team, board and management, to deliver that value generation model and to achieve that strategy. And so oversight of the business is critical. And we also give away the authority that we are given. And so we need to hold other people accountable so that we can be held accountable. And so a good policy framework is what creates that accountability. And then, so those purpose is seen as the kind of primary governance principle, the foundational governance principles flowing from that, value generation strategy, oversight, accountability, and then beyond that, a ring of almost themes that we need to be thinking about and embedding into our board process or into our thinking at governance level. Stakeholder engagement, who do we impact and how? How do we demonstrate leadership of the purpose, of the values? What do we need to make decisions? And so what needs to flow in? The data. What has to flow out? The decision making. How do we govern risk, appetite and tolerance levels? How are we socially responsible, both in the environment as well as the society that we operate in? And how do we ensure that the business is viable and performs over time? And so that, in a nutshell, is what ISO 37000 is all about. And I encourage you to get hold of it. There's a number of different summaries around it, and we're also going to be building some training on each of these key elements, or expanding our training, whether it's in our applied directorship program or our one-day programs. We'll be focusing and really rebasing a lot of what we're doing, or comparing it to how it compares to the ISO standard. So let's look at these 5 key elements that I think are really important, and what do we need to start doing if we're not doing it already? First key thing about ISO 37000 is that it was 100% consensus across all of the entities and countries and organizations that participated in the formulation and the editing of it. So the level of agreement was significant. Certainly there had been debate, but when it came to the point of putting the final picture together, it was everybody is in. And I think that shows that there is a massive consensus that companies need to think more about their governance. It's not something we can just think about, from the outside in. And it also is very much applicable to everybody. So one of the phrases in the introduction is all entities, all companies, profit, non-profit, public sector, private sector, non-profit companies. So there is something that is in it for, I mean, there's something for everybody in ISO 37000. There's a set of themes we need to think about at board level and management level, senior management level, are bought into across the board. What that means is if we have to stop, is that really it's time to stop debating about governance and time to start doing it. We often see, especially in growing companies, well, should we do we need to do this? Do we need a board? Do we need to think about governance? Well, absolutely. From day one, every company needs to be governed. And what ISO 37000 does is it gives us the framework to start thinking about it. And it's not the only one, because as we'll see a bit later, something that Sudar have done already is have some clear methodologies that help us do this. And so the debate is really over with 37,000. We now need to start holding ourselves accountable for putting in place what needs to be in place. And the challenge is that the role of the board is more the role of the head than the role of the hands, because the role of management and operations is to implement. And so I love this quote by Chesterton. He says, there is a kind of work which any man can do, but from which many men shrink. And he was obviously writing in an era where men meant men and women, because it is very hard work. Sometimes because they fear it will lead them whether they do not wish to go. This work is called thinking. And so one of the key things in response to stopping the debate and start doing is we've got to agree as boards to think, and to think deeper and harder. We've got to agree to think together, because governance is a team sport. We have to think together with the people in the room. We have to find out ways of engaging with those around the table. The process we put in place for our board decision-making should be one that triggers and deepens our thinking process. We should also think ahead, because ultimately we are, as you saw in one of those key elements, we are accountable for the viability of this entity over time. We are accountable for the health and well-being of our business, but also the health and well-being of the stakeholders that we impact through and by our business as well. And so foresight is really, really important. We need to think ahead before we think about oversight. So our strategy, where we want to be in the future, determines what we look at in the present. And it's more important than hindsight. And if all we're doing in our board meetings is looking backwards, all we're doing is we're finding out after the fact. And so really time to start thinking and time to start, actively engaging around governance. And ISO 37000 gives us some thinking tools to do that. Secondly is, as I mentioned, it's a descriptive, not a prescriptive standard. What that means is it doesn't fit into the box, just like your business. Your business doesn't fit into a box. And that's often the biggest danger we have when we either look at standards or codes, or even when we go to our favorite bookshop and we get a book off the shelf about succeeding in business, because I guarantee you that your business is probably very unlike. There may be elements that it's alike, but very unlike some of the businesses unpacked in those books. And so the challenge with best practice is it can lead us down the road of trying to look for boxes to tick. So don't look for boxes to tick. ISO 37000 is not about creating a whole lot more boxes to tick. It's about enabling governance and enabling you to do what you need to do. And the challenge is, quote by I.E. Wilson, no amount of sophistication is going to allay the fact that all your knowledge is about the past and all your decisions are about the future. So if all we are doing, as per point one, is looking back at reports, we can't change our thinking. We actually need to look forward at what lies ahead of us. And if nothing else, I think that's one of the most important lessons from the pandemic, is that it's time to stop looking back and start looking forward. Time to stop looking at what boxes we need to tick only. Obviously, there are things we sign off and things we verify and things we approve, but ultimately it doesn't start there. Those are the end result of processes that we need to design. And we need to think, we need to activate what I call the duty of imagination. So as directors, we need to be sitting around the table, and as we're thinking together, as we're thinking as a team, the key question is not whether to govern, is what does governance look like here? So what do we do in our business, in this business, no matter what size it is, no matter what sector it is, no matter what region it is, so that if we were looked at from the outside looking in, we would be able to demonstrate ethics, we'd be able to demonstrate performance, and we'd be able to demonstrate responsible stewardship. What does that look like here in our language, in our thinking? And that's the concept of apply and explain, which is probably one of the biggest challenges that every board has to think through. How do we take the principles embedded in the likes of a 37,000 and apply it to ourselves? But that application means it could and should and will look different from the business down the road. Governance is not a cut and paste exercise. It's an apply and explain, a thinking exercise as we go. And that leads us to the core, the thing at the core of ISO 37000, and actually the thing at the core of every business is its purpose. Your why determines your what. And this is not new because every single business is structured to deliver the why. If you're pursuing something, you create a system to deliver it. The challenge is, how do we think about and rethink about our purpose? Because our purpose cannot be singular. It is multifaceted because organizations are multifaceted entities. They're not just about money. They're also about people. They're also about products. They're also about goods. They're also about society. There's a whole lot of different things we need to take into account. And at the same time, not be distracted. We've got to ask the question, why? Why are we doing what we're doing? Because from the why, as I said, comes the what. And the UK principles for purposeful business, and there's a few great documents that undergird the thinking or provide insight into the thinking behind ISO 37000. And you're welcome to get hold of us and we can point you in the direction about some of those. But this is one of those. And it says an organization's purpose is summed up by the positive benefit of producing profitable solutions to problems of people and planet. And I know it's a bit of a catchphrase, lots of P words in there, but it's about what is the outcome, the positive benefit that you can create, provide, deliver. I love the phrase goods and services. We now talk about products and offerings, but actually the original phraseology was goods and services. Why? Because what we do should be good and it should serve humanity ultimately. And that's the big challenge, is how do we look at the problems of people and planet, design systems that generate value within that would ultimately be profitable, but profit as a fruit and not as the target, so that there is a positive benefit. The phraseology used in ISO 37000 is that it's about well-being outcomes and not just finance outcomes. So business as usual said finance. The only thing we measure is finance, but actually now it's about the well-being. Where do we find the way to measure that? How do we measure that? That's why the phrase ESG, environment, society, governance, is so front and center at the moment, because it's all about our impact on others and the broader impact of the business, while at the same time really thinking about how do we also ensure that we have profitability and viability within our systems. And so when we ask the why questions, we're asking the questions to go deeper. Are we deepening? We need to deepen the thinking around our purpose. We need to go wider. We need to broaden the thinking around our purpose and our values as well. And then we need to go higher. I believe that going deeper and then wider enables us to reach further than we've ever reached before. And certainly throughout Africa, where we mainly operate, there are some real problems. Go back to that quote, there are significant problems of people and planet. And if we can be part of solving those problems in a way that generates value, not just for the end user, but also for the business and those other stakeholders in the equation, really important. And so a critical conversation to have. And I believe coming out of this pandemic, and I think we've got a way to go still, but really thinking and rethinking purpose, because it's at the core. Key thing flowing from purpose, as I mentioned, is value generation. So to go wider, deeper, and broader, in a sense, we've got to rethink our operating models, and we call them business models, but I would say we actually need to argue for value generation models. What is the system that generates value? Not just profitability, but broader than that. See, ultimately, you build the system to deliver what you believe to be valuable. You measure what you value, and people's behavior is the product of that system. And there's another quote we're going to look at. A few of these quotes are quite challenging, because ultimately, if we think about how well designed is the system of your business to deliver your a renewed, a refreshed, a deepened purpose? Or is it only built to deliver one kind of thing? What are you measuring in the business? What are you holding front and center in your incentive systems? Because that's what people will ultimately do. The most powerful statement managers can make about what is important in the organization lies in what they choose to measure. Really important. Think about that. The most important statement, and I would say directors and managers can make about what is important in the organization lies in what they choose to measure. Goldratt said, "Tell me how you measure me, and I will tell you how I behave." Again, some significant quotes to take into your boardroom and to consider. And so we need to rethink our business models. What comes into our business in terms of inputs, and how are we accountable for those? What do we do with those things? What's the process we follow? And remember, each of these, we measure certain things in terms of inputs, in terms of process. What do we create? What are the outputs or the outcomes? Because ultimately, sitting around the boardroom table, we need an intimate understanding, a deep understanding of the value generation model that we are putting into the market, so that we can be held accountable for it. Because if someone had to ask you as a board member, why do you do that? You need to be able to link what you do to your purpose at its core. Why do you measure in that way? Why do you engage in that way? Why do you report in that way? Really important to think about it from an ultimate purpose point of view, because the link between what you measure and what you value is absolutely critical. Last one, and as we go through this, and again, I'll do some summarizing at the end, but also happy to take your questions around some of these things, and maybe even look at, what are the ways to do this? The approach we try to take at Sadar is very practical. We talk about the application of the principle and more than what the principle is. The principle is important, but the principle is almost technical. Application is what you need to do on a day-to-day basis. And that's why number 5, outcomes-based. The proof of governance is in the eating at the end of the day. Similar to what I've just said, but your business is currently perfectly designed to deliver the outcomes you are getting. If you're not happy with the outcomes you're getting, then you need to look at the design of the business. And so part of the role of boards is the role of architects or designers. And so when we think about this, another quote that I think is really, really powerful, and Danella Meadows is one of the people at the forefront, who has been at the forefront of systems thinking and complexity thinking for many, many years. Systems, like the 3 wishes in a fairy tale, have the terrible tendency to produce exactly and only what you ask them to produce. Quite challenging as well when we think about it. And so how do we respond to this fact that the business is currently perfectly designed to deliver the outcomes you're getting? It's good for us to step away, to go outside in a sense and look at our businesses from the outside looking in. One of the key perspectives of directors is to be able to do that, is to really be able to get an outside-in perspective and not just always an inside-out perspective. If we're inside out, we can tend to be blinkered. Once we step outside, we can examine the business from a distance, in a sense, and ask ourselves, what do things really look like here? Is the information we're getting, the information we have been getting, is it accurate? Is it telling us the truth about what we've actually had and what we actually have available to us? Our business model, if we had to look at it, what we measure, if we had to look at it, what is it actually producing? I always say there's habits of businesses. If there are things that have appeared on an agenda item for a number of quarters or months or even years, then we need to relook at it. We're not going to solve it by trying to change what we measure. We're going to change it ultimately by redesigning the system. And then begin with the end in mind. What is the view from the top? And here I'm using this. So I did choose quite a strategic photo in terms of this outcomes-based point, is that this is actually a photo from the top of Everest looking back. So what does the picture look like from the top? And too often we get somewhere and we don't reflect. And I know foresight is more important than hindsight, but we don't want to lose sight of the fact that we can learn significantly by looking and saying, where have we come from? And if we had to do this all over again, what would we actually do? So begin with the end in mind. What is the view from the top? What can we learn? If we are pursuing an objective into the future, how do we put ourselves into that future position and look back to where we are now and ask the question, what could they look like, so that we are ultimately ethical, outcomes-based, ethical culture. We're effective in our performance and controls, but we're also enhancing. And I chose that word specifically to sum up some of the thinking undergirding this responsible stewardship thinking that governs a lot of the outcomes-based thinking of ISO 37000. Are we adding value broader in terms of our impact, or are we extracting value from parties that is not ethical and not very effective? And so in thinking about ISO 37000, those 5 key things are really, really important. And just to summarize what the outcomes are, and I'd love to get your questions on any of these elements, but also on ISO 37000. If you've got any questions around that, please use the chat box, and please use the Q&A box as well. So what does the route map look like? The route map is stop debating, start deciding and doing. Decide to engage with governance. And what we've often had the privilege of doing is really help companies take those first steps. Even prior to joining CEDAW, one of my first, it was one of the, interesting independent director roles I played was at a mining company. I know very little about mining, but my role was they had stopped debating and they knew that this thing was important. And so it essentially started with, let's just try to meet together regularly, have the right conversations and start doing this thing, because it doesn't need to be perfect for us to start doing. Your first board may not get its composition right. Your first board meeting may seem like a little bit of a hash of topics, but as time goes on, by doing it, it tends to align and we tend to move forward. Think together. Ask the questions regularly. What does this look like here? Not just what does it look like in the mind of the person writing the recommendation, but what does that look like here? We know our companies. We know them well. We're the ones who are answerable for what we do here. And so we need to think together with those in the room and apply and explain. Key question we need to ask as well is why. Focus on purpose and values. Many of the initial models of ISO 37000 didn't just have the word purpose in that center core, that purpose and values. And it's embedded in that as well. And the idea was to find a succinct word or phrase that summed it up. Keep asking why. Good way to start every board meeting is to revisit your purpose, revisit your strategy, not rehash it, but just to touch on it and say, why are we sitting in the room? Because that's what aligns our decision-making, our accountability, our delegation of authority, all of those things as we go. And then determine value and design to deliver it. So what I mean by that is really think through what value, based on your purpose and values, you see you being able to create. What does that look like across your range of stakeholders, across your range of different parties that you impact? What is value to them? What is value to your employees? What is value to your suppliers? What is value to your customers? Not just in terms of the product you're selling or the goods and services, but how do you properly understand the value that you have to the different parties? I mean, sometimes your value to your employees is simply the paycheck at the end of the month, and that's perfectly valid. Make sure you design the system to deliver that on an ongoing basis. Design to deliver the value. And then lastly, what does the view from the top look like? Are you aiming at something significant? Are you aiming at something that is a valid expression of your purpose, that enables you, when you get to that point in time and look back, it'll be valuable for yourself? Because value is not just only financial. It is that in some senses, but it's a whole range of other things. And so as leaders of our organizations, let's take ISO 37000 and allow it to provide some guidance in terms of what are the themes we need to be addressing, what are the things we need to be talking about, and identify and get our teams involved in having conversations around some of these key issues. And end of the year, beginning of a new year is always an opportunity to relook at where we've been, where we want to go. And ISO 37000 gives us some thoughts there. So I'd love to get any questions or comments as we go. I'm going to quickly jump back to the picture of ISO 37000, and maybe there's some reflections on that. because there's a fair amount of detail even in the illustration or the model itself, which are really, really powerful. But any questions or comments? Even if this has been valuable, it'd be great to get that comment or that question on the chat box or the Q&A session. Also, we're not a huge group, so if you want to, you're welcome to also, I think I can unmute people from here. So if you want to chip in as well, you're welcome to. If you want to just, put up your hand, and welcome. Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, often it's good just to get that first view, and what I encourage you to do, so Google it. You can get this picture. You can also get some of the definitions free. At the moment, the actual code itself is fairly expensive, and but over time it'll probably get cheaper. Is this model in the standard? Yep. So this picture's in the standard, and this picture's also in the public domain. This is part of their free. There's a free set of definitions which includes this picture, as well as some of the introductions. Yep, Matthew, we'll send this. We'll let you have access to the slides. I'm happy to do that as well. And please, if if there are any areas that you need to engage with, and any of the key questions that I've given you to address, those points on the journey in a sense, then please engage with us. I want to quickly, as we close and as we pick up on any other questions. So at Sadar, we use a tool we call the Sadar Enterprise Governance Compass. It's a tool that has been developed over the years and used over the years to really guide the methodology in the boardroom. And when ISO 37000 came out, I thought, let me just quickly map the themes so that we can look and see, because as I said, there's not too much that in one sense is new. So obviously from the purpose, we've always had purpose as true north. True north is the thing that determines where you want to go, it helps you find every direction, and every decision in a business is about purpose. Also, strategy and direction flows from that. So purpose, strategy, and direction. Purpose being why, strategy being what does it look like, direction being what step do we take next. Ethical behavior, organizational culture, critical conversation in the boardroom around ethics and values, and what do we truly value? What do we truly put into our behavior? Because value determines behavior, and ethics is determined or viewed from the outside looking out, from the outside looking in. Apologies. There's obviously leadership. Key role of the board is to lead the organization. Boards don't just sit in a static position. They actually need to be out front, leading the organization on its way forward. Performance linked to leadership, and I think it's interesting that just graphically or in the picture, performance and leadership are close together in both the governance compass and ISO 37000. Oversight, a key part of leadership is oversight, is how do we get that information? And so phrase I often use is that it's policy that creates the link between purpose and performance, and a key part of policy is to provide oversight. It also provides accountability, but oversight being critical there as well. Accountability for performance. What system are we using to measure people? How are we measuring them? How are we holding them accountable for the authority we've delegated to them as we move forward? And have we designed that system for performance as well? Stakeholder engagement, obviously, is one of the sections, but also a critical part of, we call it the southern part of the compass. Are we aware of who we engage with? How do we impact them? How do they influence us in our businesses? Sustainability, both responsible stewardship and viability and performance over time. And I think what's quite powerful in ISO 37000 is, unfortunately, the word sustainability has become something that is almost environmental as opposed to about the company. And so it's critical here that phrase they've chosen, I think, which is quite important, viability of and performance of the company over time, is ultimately sustainability, as well as our impact on others. Accountability critical as well. How do we give an account for our reporting? Integrated reporting, the value reporting framework, sustainability reporting, all of those themes that need to be addressed as well. And as mentioned, the viability and performance over time. Value generation. What is the model for delivering our strategy? Okay, so what is the business model? And business model is, both there as well as there. What does it result in? And so we have shareholder returns, but shareholder returns are actually only one type of return that we need to give an account for. We need to give an account for the value to all parties in a sense. Risk governance, key theme. And here we have obviously ISO 31000, which is an important risk governance standard. But you can see also the shift of thinking into the governance space is important, because that's about appetite and tolerance levels, as opposed to just the mechanics of governing or managing risk as well. Data and decisions, we have results, and obviously the financial results are one aspect, but what are the consolidated information that is flowing in? I suppose I could put performance and conformance as linked to that data and decisions. Is what are we measuring ultimately is what we're going to get at the end of the day. And so if we put it together, and I know this is a bit of a all in, but as mentioned, in a sense, not too much that's new. There are the SADAR methodology, there are other methodologies, but we're able to help companies in both guiding the implementation of boards. Taking the first steps is absolutely critical in getting governance in every single business and organization. And so any questions, comments around that? So to jump back to this one, any thoughts, any reflections? So thank you for taking the time, and please engage with us if there are any questions, comments you have around how to do this, how to put it into practice, how to have those thinking conversations, how to take any of these key steps that I have identified. Then please give us a shout, and we would welcome the opportunity of assisting you in applying and explaining and delivering value based on your purpose. All the very best. Have a wonderful afternoon further, and hopefully we'll be in touch sometime. Thank you.